The NFL regular season is wrapping up, but there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. The app is so easy to use, and there are so many different ways to bet, like live same-game parlays. Find bets in the new Explore tab. Make a parlay in the Parlay Hub, the best way to find popular parlays, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/247 and make your first bet a layup. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL.
Must be 21 plus and present in Arizona, Colorado, Connecticut, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, permitted parishes only, Massachusetts, Maryland, Michigan, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, or Wyoming. FanDuel is offering online sports wagering in Kansas under an agreement with Kansas Star Casino, LLC. First online real money wager only. $10 first deposit required. Bonus issued as non-withdrawable bonus bets that expire 7 days after receipt. Restrictions apply. See terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit fanduel.com/RG in Colorado, Iowa, Michigan, New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP or text NEXT-STEP to 53342 in Arizona, 1-888-789-7777, or visit ccpg.org/chat in Connecticut, 1-800-9-WITH-IT in Indiana, 1-800-522-4700, or visit ksgamblinghelp.com in Kansas, 1-877-770-STOP in Louisiana. Visit mdgamblinghelp.org in Maryland. Visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net in West Virginia, or call 1-800-522-4700 in Wyoming. Hope is here. Visit gamblinghelplinema.org or call 800-327-5050 for 24/7 support in Massachusetts, or call 1-877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY in New York, or visit oasas.ny.gov/gambling. Standard text messaging rates apply. Sports betting is void in Georgia, Hawaii, Utah, and other states where prohibited.
You've discovered your link to GoPowercat.com's Powercat Podcast. Now, here's your host, GoPowercat.com's Ryan Wallace.
Welcome to GoPowercat.com for a special edition of the Powercat Podcast, our Sources Podcast. We didn't get a chance to do a full-on recruiting podcast for early signing day, but have no fear. This is it. This is the one that you all have been calling for, and I am pleased to be joined by Kevin Flaherty, a counterpart at 24/7 Sports. Kevin, first off, we'll bring you in here, and I guess technically you are a national college basketball writer for 24/7, but I got to be honest, for those maybe outside the loop who don't follow you on Twitter, you should, because he's got a very good handle on the pulse of Kansas high school football recruiting. So I know that you're excited to talk not only about K-State's class a little bit, but also just about the prospects in Kansas for 2021 and 2022.
Yeah. I came up in the state and then, started off at the Paola paper, and then went to the Morning Sun in Pittsburgh. So, got to see quite a bit of high school football through all of that. Covered Kansas for FOG.net during that time too, and covered a lot of football recruiting, and then went down, covered Texas for a little while, and came back. And Ryan, we really had a chance to get out and see a lot of these guys in person. When you look at the top guys in the state and kind of the circumstances that we face this year in terms of not having, maybe as many combines or as many games in some cases, or chances to get out, I really feel like we actually did a pretty good job of crisscrossing the state and seeing these guys.
Absolutely. And one thing that I wanted to touch on real quick, just kind of as an overarching topic before we dive in specifically to 2021 and 2022 is, you mentioned covering Texas recruiting, back in the Mac Brown days, the heydays of Texas football, really. Sure. And how far do you feel like since, you first started covering Kansas football and playing Kansas high school football yourself?
Yeah, not well, though. Not well.
But how far has just the scope of Kansas football and that landscape of recruiting come since, you first started covering to, having covered a state like Texas, and we know the rich talent that it provides. It seems like Kansas has really seen a surge as far as the level of play that it's producing.
It's totally changed, Ryan. And from where it was in, say, 2005, 2006-ish, when I really started getting into it, maybe even, a class or two before that, you would look at the state and there would maybe be 10 Division I guys that we would know about. And out of those guys, you were looking at even, further limitations in terms of who is capable of playing at Kansas or Kansas State right out of high school. Obviously that number got bigger once guys spent time in junior college and you saw those guys develop. Honestly, I think that it's more than double that now. I think in an average class now, you have 10 to 14 guys that you could legitimately argue are Kansas or Kansas State type guys in a lot of these classes. And, you look at that group and then you say, well, on top of that, there's maybe another, 5, 10 or so guys that are legitimately Division I type guys. Not all of them wind up going FBS. And in this year's class in particular, I know, Ryan, there were some guys that maybe we felt like locally were those kinds of guys who didn't get a chance to impress upon college coaches in person or whatever else. But the scope of it has totally changed in terms of the number of kids we see. And I think that, the combine part is a big part of it. Obviously, the widespread use of huddle and things like that, instead of looking across, grainy YouTube tapes where in some cases you weren't even sure who you were supposed to even be looking at. But I do think that there are more kids now that you can evaluate across the state and say, hey, this is a Kansas guy. This is a Kansas State guy. This is a regional guy who, could have Nebraska, Oklahoma offering. And further, down the line, the guys who are going to be MAC guys or maybe lower level FBS guys.
Well, let's jump into the Kansas State 2021 signing class, at least so far, that took place back on Wednesday. And like I said, we'll touch a little bit more just on the Sunflower State in general, particularly with 2022 rankings here coming up a little bit later. But Kevin, as far as just the 2021 class that K-State has signed thus far, what impresses you off the cuff about what the Wildcats were able to do? For me, as you and I have talked about leading up to signing day and even in the hours since signing day, for me, it's the versatility of this class and the flexibility. There are so many non-positional type players that I feel like Chris Kleiman got that I don't know if that was intended or just kind of an added bonus for the coaching staff. But I mean, you go down this list and, Marvin Martin is a guy that I feel like could play anything from nickel, safety, linebacker. Braden Wood is a defensive tackle at heart. But I mean, depending on, if he's part of the quote jet package that the third down package, he could swing inside or outside. Darrell Jones is a guy that maybe could play some nickel. We saw him this year playing almost kind of like a pseudo outside linebacker at the high school level.
Sure.
Maybe he could play nickel, cornerback, receiver, returner. You go down the line, Gavin Hazelhorst is a guy, and we'll talk about him, I'm sure, plenty in this podcast. Devin Weathers was a guy that they thought might play defense and cornerback, safety. Now he's going to play running back. Even a guy like Andrew Langang, who I think most people just view him as an offensive tackle or an offensive lineman, but I mean, he can literally play all 5 spots on the offensive line. So again, in a year like COVID, where depth became so important, the options that Kansas State will have, being able to rotate guys, you play a little bit here, practice a little bit here, so that in games you have that flexibility. I just think that's huge for the class that K-State signed so far.
Sure, and a guy like Crew Jackson as well. Yeah. I mean, I have no idea what that kid is going to be with that frame. You know, he's more of, you know, we've talked about Isaiah Simmons in the past being a guy that it didn't really matter what you thought he was going to play. Just lock him in your weight room for a couple of years and see what happens. And I think Crew Jackson is that type of guy where you don't even necessarily go in thinking, okay, this guy's a safety, he's an outside linebacker, he's an edge guy. See what he eats and lifts himself into. The other thing, you know, the two things that I like to look at in particular, because we found that when teams basically, when they do well nationally, they've recruited really well at these two spots. And I think it's quarterback and pass rush, you know, quarterback and getting to the quarterback, basically. And Kansas State landed its guy and Jake Rubley. I know, you know, Ryan, you and I have talked about him and him in comparison to what Kansas State already has on campus, you know, with a guy like Will Howard. I think Will Howard's a little more gifted physically, a little more arm strength. But the thing that really impresses you with Jake Rubley on tape is the level of polish that he displays. You know, he's looking off defenders. He's going through his reads. He's doing things that you would expect maybe a college sophomore or college junior to do, and you're seeing him on his high school tape. And so for Kansas State to get that type of guy, and obviously there are a few coaches, you know, kind of at this point in America where you're not recruiting the number one or number two guy, you know, in the entire class, that you would trust more with quarterback evaluations than the guys that K-State have. And the other thing is pass rush. And you know, I like Ozzie Hoffler a lot. I think that, and again, we're gonna talk about this a little more. I think Gavin Hazelhorst eventually winds up being a pass rusher as well. You know, Crew Jackson, again, is somebody that could wind up being that guy. You talked about Braden Wood being somebody that can maybe rush the passer from multiple spots depending on the package and things like that. And so in a smaller class, you know, to go out and get your quarterback and get a few guys that can get after the quarterback, I think Kansas State really did its due diligence and came out well there.
Well, let's transition to the two of the players that I think 24/7 in particular, when you look past the composite rankings, feel were kind of the two gems of this class for K-State. And one on defense and Gavin Hazelhorst, who our national analysts love him. I mean, the experts at 24/7 just think the world of this kid. And then on offense, it's obviously Jake Rubley. Let's start with Rubley since you touched on him for a minute. He's going to be interesting to see compete with Will Howard from the simple standpoint of what you said, where Jake seems to be a little bit further along in his IQ than maybe Will showed on tape. But as you and I were talking about, leading up to signing day, it's almost to me like I was more taken by Will Howard's film than I was Jake Rubley's film. And I realized Jake Rubley only got, 3 or 4 games in with West Des Moines Valley this year before the Iowa High School Activities Association stepped in and say, oh, wait a second, on second thought, we're going to rule you ineligible. How much of that plays into things, and how much, Will Howard's not having kind of a full year of preparation under his belt because of COVID plays into things is kind of another topic in and of itself, because on one hand, I think normally you would say, well, Will be farther along than Jake will be because he would have had a full off season since he arrived last January, full off season, played much of this season, and now he'll, kind of have a full year's work under his belt. Well, he got the game experience under his belt, but he's still, he's not quite as far along as we saw in the game that maybe you would have preferred him to be as a freshman. Now Jake Rubley comes in and from an IQ standpoint might even meet him kind of on a more equal level than we thought. But as I said, Kevin, what makes this so kind of interesting to me is that I was so taken by Will Howard's film, and he just didn't really put it on tape for his freshman year at K-State. But I'm not as taken by Jake Rubley on film, but he's a little bit further along in the area that Will seemed to struggle, which was the speed of the game and just identifying things. So ideally, I would have said this won't be as close of a battle as people want to make it. But I'm starting to wonder if maybe this will be a little bit bigger of a competition than I initially thought.
It's funny because after last season and the issues that TCU had with Max Duggan playing as a true freshman, I think you and I were talking about it, and I said, Max Duggan, maybe more than any other player in the country, if you put together a highlight tape of just his great throws and left out all the bad stuff, somebody would look at that and say, oh my gosh, this is a first round pick, right? Because he put those throws on tape and they weren't there consistently for him, and he turned the ball over and he made bad decisions. But if you just took the good and you just took, okay, here's Max Duggan on a 3rd and 18, just rearing back and putting this ball absolutely on a guy, and that was all you saw, you would have said, okay, this guy's a first-round pick. And I think you can see some similarities there between him and Will Howard, and that some of the throws that Will Howard made, his first completion at Kansas State, goodness.
Yeah.
I mean, the way that he pinched that in, and then, you think about the touchdown pass, to Deuce Vaughn against West Virginia, where he kind of put that between two defenders. I don't know that other Big 12 quarterbacks would or should even attempt that throw. And so, if you made like a highlight tape and just said, you know what, this is going to be a pump-up tape, we're going to show Will Howard, it's just his best plays, you would come away thinking, oh my gosh, this guy is the quarterback of the future. He's the guy. The problem is that you can't take all that other stuff out. You can't take the bad decisions, or when he didn't read the underneath guy and threw, the big interceptions against Texas that were kind of backbreaking, when they happened. And some of the decisions, or even some of the indecision, when you looked at it and you said, hey, here's this guy right here, this is where the ball needs to go, and he's looking at him, and you can see that the confidence just wasn't quite there to turn that ball loose the way that it was. And so I 100% agree with you. I loved Will Howard's high school tape. I mean, it was, at least once or twice a game he would make a throw where you would say, oh my gosh, that's an NFL throw right there. And so I think that on a highlight tape standpoint, he's going to come ahead. He's going to come out looking better than Jake Rubley would. Right. At the same time, as we've seen a number of times, there are guys that put together great highlight tapes and maybe aren't quite as good, as actualized players. And I think that Jake Rubley is fairly actualized. Like if you look at his highlight tape and you look at his game tape, there's not that much difference, because he's still doing things in terms of checking plays, in terms of manipulating the coverage with his eyes, even little things that you don't think about. Like you see a throw and you're like, man, that wasn't a great throw, but he's got a guy open and he makes sure that he puts it where the guy can catch it. He doesn't put it 10 yards over his head. Yeah. And so maybe he didn't turn it loose and it didn't look, like the best possible throw. And yet you say, well, okay, here's a guy who knows he has a 20-yard completion and takes the 20-yard completion. He's not trying to miss that guy. And so I think that could make this competition really interesting in terms of how quickly he picks up the system, because I think that he's advanced in some of those ways that maybe Will Howard wasn't coming in. And then even beyond that, and I think this, kind of goes to the point of what you were talking about. I think that some of it is ahead of what we even saw from Will Howard later in the season with game experience under his belt.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, that's why this off season is going to be so telling. And I don't really know who it favors more. Does not having a typical off season, at least as we sit here today, it doesn't look like it will be a typical kind of spring football calendar. Does that help Jake Rubley a little bit? Does that help Will Howard stay maybe a little bit ahead of Jake Rubley, that he won't be able to, get that spring practice competition kind of under his belt? I don't know, but I do agree. It kind of comes down to, Will Howard seems to do a little bit more of the physical things a little bit better, but I also harken back to something that we did with Jesse Ertz on signing day last year, where we had former Wildcats that played the positions of some of the best guys coming in from that 2020 class, kind of break down film. And one of the things Jesse Ertz talked about with Will Howard was that he kind of has a tendency to lock in on a favorite route or a favorite receiver. You don't see that with Jake Rubley. And that's kind of the things that you and I are talking about, just with his IQ and everything else. So that obviously is going to be a position to watch, regardless of whether Skylar Thompson comes back or not, because with Nick Ost out of the picture, you got to have a backup. Will it be Rubley? Will it be Howard? Time will tell. Now, moving to the other player that I kind of teased up front as being very highly regarded, according to our 24/7 analyst, and that's Gavin Hazelhorst. And we got a chance to see Gavin run anyway. Couldn't get a chance to see him do a whole lot else at the Sharp Combine in Salina. And I mean, right after that, K-State jumps on the offer. Really liked how he tested. Saw some of those videos that obviously kind of went viral around the state of just how much he can lift. We all know how strong he is. But let me start off by saying this, Kevin, and it'll kind of be the first of maybe one or two things that we'll touch on with this K-State class where I might come off a little bit critical, but the idea of Gavin Hazelhorst as a linebacker in a predominant nickel-based defense is not something that I have a lot of confidence in. I have a lot of confidence in Gavin Hazelhorst being able to become a productive football player at K-State. That's not the issue. The issue is on tape, and even Zach Carlson and some others that I've talked to that have been able to see Gavin play in person, he's a north-south guy. He is a bull-rushing, power, just brute strength bull rusher, if you will, that I kind of compare to like an Adam Davis, former Wildcat on the last Big 12 title team that K-State had, that I think would make a bigger difference as a defensive end than a linebacker. We'll start there. What say you, Kevin?
I think you're absolutely right. I think Hazelhorst, I see where you can get inside linebacker based on the build. I mean, he's a fire hydrant, right? I mean, he's 6'1", 230, and if you see him, he's not going to get to be, what you would ideally like your defensive end to be from a weight standpoint and have it still be good weight. Having said that, I don't think it matters because of his strength level, because of the pad level that he plays with. And he is a special athlete moving forward, right? I mean, when you look at the 40 time, the 4.56 that he ran, yes, it was handheld. You look at the vertical, the 34 inches, you look at the bench press, and, this guy basically, looks like he walks around, dragging trucks behind him. I mean, he's the type of guy that I think when you see all of that up close and in person, you kind of think about him as a linebacker, dropping back or needing to diagnose something before, and you just say, this guy is so special going forward. Why would you make him go back? Why would you make him turn and run? Why would you make him, do things that aren't within that wheelhouse? Because I don't think he's as good an athlete laterally as he is from a straightforward standpoint. And he's terrific from a straightforward standpoint. I mean, he's got the speed to get by somebody on the edge. And the worst part about it, as somebody who tries to block him, and I know, Ryan, you can attest to this, he's got Mike Tyson hands. I mean, he can get going downhill and then sort of stop and pop that hand up, and with one hand, he can put an offensive tackle on his backside.
He is one of the more intriguing players in this class for me, not just purely for how his career will turn out, but just how long he lasts at linebacker and how quickly they can either develop him there or how quickly the staff goes, you know what, let's just get you back to what you're good at. And that's just see ball, get ball kind of stuff, and not force him to be an east-west guy, make him be a north-south guy. Because like you said, it's not just the 40 time that was so impressive when we saw him literally run past us in Salina. It was like the way that he runs. I mean, his technique was smooth. What he did in the first 10 yards was incredible, let alone what he was doing, for the full 40. So that kind of segues me into this next part about this class. And it's one that, whether you're at K-State, KU, Alabama, everybody always wants to know, well, what's kind of your overall thoughts on the class? And up front, I said that I love the flexibility, love the versatility of this class. And I do think, much like we saw from the group that Chris Kleiman signed in 2020, it's high on upside. I mean, there's a big ceiling for the majority of this group if they develop the way that we think they could or that they will. And that's kind of where you and I were talking about, and credit to you. I think sometimes I get a little overly critical because I'm looking at this class from start to finish and really taking a fine tooth comb through it and debating on whether this is a class that is of an A grade right now or kind of a B grade. And I fall more in the B grade only because I like the staple that you get in Jake Rubley. I'm very high on kind of a sleeper kid in RJ Garcia that I think can come in and maybe make a quicker impact than his recruiting ranking and some of his offers would kind of dictate. Still needs to put on some weight, but I think he's a natural receiver that this group needs. And I'm really high on Austin Weiner and love Andrew Langane. But after that, things get a little dicey for me. I'm not sure what to make of Darrell Jones. He's a very, very raw cornerback that is unbelievably fast, but is behind technically. I don't know what to make of Brennan Hawkins, who has all the size gifts, but, really didn't have much of a senior season due to injury. Is he more than a one-trick pony? Is Devin Weathers, who puts a lot on tape, but when I saw him in person, is he a really gifted running back or is he a really gifted high school running back? Can he really be kind of the power guy that K-State wants him to be? What is Crew Jackson? What is Marvin Martin? To me, Kevin, and this is where I'll turn it over to you, I don't want to be overly critiquey, if that's a word, of a group that carries the highest average per signee rating in the 24/7 sports era that could finish top 50 nationally for the first time since 2014. But there are a lot of projects in this class for a program that I think maybe could have used some more immediate impact in certain areas.
One of the assistant coaches that I talked to from the Mangino era at Kansas, one of the things that he had said kind of as a going out thing, when they finished up and they were out the door, one of the things that he had said that looking back, he wished that they would have done more was bet on traits. They obviously had a lot of success there for a couple years. They were around 500, I think, for most of the time there. Had the year in 2007 with the Orange Bowl, had the year in 2008 where they won another 8 games. And then after the next year where they had a losing record, they were out. And he said, a lot of times when we made misses in recruiting, it was going for the guy that we felt like, hey, this guy is a good football player, but maybe he doesn't have the traits. Maybe he's a linebacker that runs 4.8, and we think, okay, he's a good football player. He'll figure it out. And he was saying that he wished they would have bet more on the linebacker who runs 4.5, even if he doesn't know what he's doing yet. And I think, using that as a seg in and going away from Kansas before, I get beat up for this on the K-State podcast. this is a very trait-heavy class. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, you look at a guy like Devontae Pritchard can really run for the position. You know, when we saw him as a junior, he was a lot more raw and was a lot more tentative, I think, in the game that we saw him. And you can see, no question, like this is a Big 12 linebacker prospect based on the athleticism and the things that he had, but he wasn't quite there yet. And he looked better as a senior. But again, a very traitsy guy whose best football is ahead of him. I think when you look at you know, Jarrell Jones is a guy whose best football is probably ahead of him, and he's got the traits that you would want. I mean, he's 5'11", you know, he's got decent length too. I mean, nobody talks about that because of the speed, but ran in the 4.3s when we saw him. He was so impressive with the 40 time, Ryan, that people, you know, don't mention he had a 40.5-inch vertical at that same moment.
That's right.
What does that say that you know, just pop off a 40-inch vertical and nobody talks about it? I mean, that's the kind of athlete that he is. I think that, you know, Marvin Martin is a guy that can play several different spots in the secondary, might even play early. I mean, depending on what happens at nickelback, right? Sure. State and everything. And, you know, RJ Garcia, I feel like, is a toolsy guy. Gavin, the reason Gavin Hazelhorst is so high in the rankings is our guys flat out, our national guys flat out looked at him, looked at the tapes, looked at everything and said, in 4 years, when this guy's at the NFL scouting combine, his stock is only going to go up, because whenever this guy tests in front of somebody, you know, they're gonna absolutely love him. I think Ozzie Hoffler is a guy, you know, I don't know what his 40 time is, but he is fast on tape.
Yeah.
I mean, not only does he run around guys, but he's got closing speed as well. And, you know, it's hard to tell what his technique is on tape because he doesn't have to use it that much. And then, you know, you look at a guy like Austin Weiner, that I think you and I were significantly higher on Austin Weiner probably than the general consensus. And
100%.
And more than our national guys, you know, who maybe didn't get a chance to see him in person. And that's not a knock on those guys, but I think you look at him, you look at the frame, you see the length, you look at him at tight end and the way that he runs and moves. He is more fluid as a bend and run athlete than the Mason Richmond kid that Iowa was so excited about in last year's class. He is more of a tight end, you know, fluid type athlete, I feel like, than Richmond was. And Richmond was a little bit bigger, but I think when you're projecting guys forward and saying, okay, you know, based on Austin's dad, for one, you know, you have a pretty good idea there. But this is not a kid who's going to be 240 pounds forever, you know, and he's going to come out on the other side being 290 or 300 pounds. And at that point, you know, you're talking about a guy with his feet, with his, you know, athleticism and speed. And yet when you look at Austin, and this is one of the things that kind of cracks me up, you know, about K-State's class, Ryan, out of the 14 guys that K-State announced on scholarship, he's ranked the lowest in the 24/7 Sports Composite. And that's industry generated. I don't think a lot of people realize, like, that is the major recruiting sites altogether. Like the top 247 and everything, that's our ranking. That's how we see these guys. And then you can compare it against the composite, which is sort of the industry consensus for how they see these players. And the industry consensus was that Austin was the lowest ranked out of this Kansas State class. And yet you look at him in person, as both you and I did, and I think you see a guy that has a pretty significant amount of upside and ceiling that, you know, he could come out on the other side and be a potential NFL player if he fills out and things go correctly.
Yeah, I mean, you don't see guys that are 6'7" that move the way that he does so fluidly, and yet even at 240 pounds, when he gets locked in on a blocking assignment, it's game over. So love Austin Weiner. Well, real quick, Kevin, before we kind of hit a break, let's try and pick off a handful of questions that we received from some subscribers over at Wabash Station. The first comes from Wagcat, and maybe we touched on it here in that last portion, maybe not. He says, I know we like to focus on who the biggest surprises will be, but can you name a few recruits where you might have concerns about how well they'll fit at the Power 5 level from the standpoint of K-State signees? I guess I'll lead things off. It's not, again, whether he fits or not, but where Gavin Hazelhorst winds up positionally. And then I will stick probably with Darrell Jones for me. And maybe I'm getting too caught up in trying to place him, whereas you said, just look at the tools and figure it out, because clearly he can play. So that's not really knocking Darrell. It's just, again, kind of a concern of where he plays and how long it takes him to really learn the fundamentals that Van Malone is going to teach him at cornerback.
Yeah, I would also go with Darrell, and not an insult on the kid, but I think that when you saw a lot of the teams that Field Kinley played against, and we saw him against Fort Scott, Fort Scott's going to run the ball 65 times. And so when you see Darrell Jones out there, you didn't see him very often in a situation where he was tested by a Division I caliber quarterback throwing to a Division I caliber wide receiver. And obviously that's all that he's going to be facing from here on out. And, when we had a chance to see him at the Kansas City area showcase, and I know, Ryan, you saw more of him there than I did.
Yeah.
There were some struggles there going up against, some of Kansas City's better wide receivers and things like that. And it's not that I don't doubt the gifts, because like I said, he's got length, he's athletic as all get out. It's just a question of how quickly does he pick up those things and whether he can go ahead and do that. And, if that doesn't work, maybe you just say, what, this guy can run really fast in a straight line. Let's toss him over to wide receiver. But I do have some of those concerns there a little bit. The other one would probably be, and I know he's one of the lower rated guys in K-State's class, but Devin Weathers is a heck of a player. He really is. But at the same time, I have some of the same concerns you do, in that not will this guy be able to play at K-State, but does he ever become more than a rotational back? Does he become somebody that K-State, feels good? It's, 3rd and 3 in a big game with 4 minutes left. Is Devin Weathers the guy? Does he get to be the guy where they say, you know what, it's on your shoulders, go get us these 3 yards? I don't know the answer to that. There's a chance that he winds up being that guy. I tend to think, based over the last few classes and even before, accounting for Deuce Vaughn being what he, was and is, I tend to think K-State has recruited some guys maybe with a little more ability than Weathers who haven't panned out yet. And so that makes me pause a little bit, because I look at it and I say, well, if this guy is maybe bigger or faster or whatever, or has these traits, or I think he might just flat be better than Devin Weathers, and he's not making it, is Devin going to make it? And that's kind of my question there. I think that there's a good chance he joins the rotation at running back. And the good thing about him is, as an athlete, if he doesn't work out there, there are other spots you can try him. But I do wonder a little bit, what the upside is there for him at running back, as opposed to some of these other guys that kind of do have that high ceiling at their respective positions.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. When I heard the news from our Adam Suderman, when he talked to Devin before signing day, that they were exclusively talking to him about playing running back, It was a good move, because I didn't like the idea that K-State had originally of putting him at a cornerback, but It was also a bad move, because I'm not that far off of thinking that maybe his best days could be as a safety.
I'm right there with you. I think that could be where he winds up eventually. That could be his spot.
So we'll just have to see. Last but not least, again, heading towards a break, but I want to squeeze in. The topic of the transfer portal was obviously heavy in our questions. Here were two from Wildcat Pilot 88 and ContraCat, that I'm going to throw your way. Wildcat Pilot 88 asks, how might an inflated transfer portal affect the high school class of 2021, the guys that haven't signed yet, and the upcoming class of 2022? And on top of that, ContraCat wants to know, overall in college football, in generally speaking, what programs care the least about the portal and who seems to care the most and maybe needs the portal the most?
Oh, wow. There are a lot of questions in there. And they don't all necessarily have easy answers. But I think the main impact you're going to see from the transfer portal is not as much on 2021. I mean, I realize that, you have to have a few spots left to be able to offer those guys. But I tend to think in general, 2022 classes, I think across the board are going to be significantly smaller, Ryan. Like, I don't think that you're going to see a lot of teams taking 25-man recruiting classes. And some of that is because, seniors returning to schools, are going to be there and taking an extra year, which maybe, pushes guys into red shirts and extends things there. You have all the transfer portal entries. The most obvious school that could use the transfer portal is Kansas, because you need more Division I talent there. Although I don't know that they have the scholarships there. It seems like, to me, and maybe this is wrong, but it seems like the academic schools, the schools that really pride themselves on academics, don't necessarily get into the transfer portal as much. I mean, you don't usually hear, I don't think, about, oh man, Stanford is just going to pound the transfer portal this year. But I also think that it gets really interesting with the number of transfers that you see in there. And that there was one school I know that was saying, hey, we're only going to take a transfer guy if he's a starting offensive lineman and has 3 years of eligibility left, a Division I starting offensive lineman. And I think most cycles, Ryan, you would say, okay, that guy's not in the portal.
Yeah.
Because if he started as a freshman, that's just that guy is going to stay at his school.
He's not leaving. Yeah,
he's not leaving. And the coaches are probably, putting a lock on his car so he can't go anywhere. But with the explosion of the transfer portal, with the eligibility years forgiveness, all of a sudden that includes sophomores now as well, because a guy who is a sophomore starter this year, if he decides he wants to go somewhere else, he's still a sophomore next year. And so, I think that there are more guys that sort of fit what teams want, even when they're being hyper specific. And so I do think that teams are going to make use of this. And I think you'll see K-State, don't you, Ryan, take advantage of this, even if it's not, say, taking 7 guys. But I think that you can see K-State being very proactive and finding a few guys that they feel like can fill a hole or two.
100%. I think that K-State will target, a tight end in the portal specifically for this upcoming class. I think that's an area that they'd like to replace a guy like Briley Moore with someone that could be similar to Briley Moore right away. I think safety is another spot that, the depth was really hit hard by transfer portal departures, that maybe they'll go look there. And I still think that they're not opposed to bringing a true offensive tackle in to give, Carver Willis a little bit more time to develop, to give Weiner and Langang a little bit more time to develop, and push Katori Leviston and Christian Duffy a little bit more, and maybe a wide receiver as well. Those are kind of the 4 positions right now that I would think, aside from maybe defensive tackle, that I think K-State will focus with the portal. And as we segue into a break and kind of head towards our second part of the podcast, which does focus on the 2022 class in Kansas, Kevin mentioned the transfer portal effect is going to be huge on 2022. If you don't believe what Kevin just said, take it from K-State's director of recruiting, Taylor Bratt, who tweeted out this on Friday. I worry about the 2022 class with everyone given kind of a free go of it again. He says a junior is going to be a junior again, and next year we will have to have our scholarship numbers back to 85 and still sign a class in 2022. So it is definitely on the minds of the guys in Manhattan. Well, with that, we will take a quick break, and on the other side, we've got a couple more of your questions to answer, and we will preview what will be a loaded 2022 class in the state of Kansas. Hang tight.
The Powercat Podcast. We'll be right back.
Selling a little or a lot? Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage, to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit 1 million orders stage. Shopify is here to help you grow. Whether you're selling scented soap or offering outdoor outfits, Shopify helps you sell everywhere. From their all-in-one e-commerce platform to their in-person POS system, wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout. 15% better on average compared to other leading commerce platforms. And sell more with less effort thanks to Shopify Magic, your AI-powered all-star. Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the US. And Shopify is the global force behind Allbirds, Rothy's, and Brooklinen, and millions of other entrepreneurs of every size across 175 countries. Plus, Shopify's award-winning 24/7 help is there to support your success every step of the way. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/Odyssey Podcast, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/Odyssey Podcast now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/Odyssey Podcast.
JamesAllen.com is the online destination to easily design a customized engagement ring and save up to 50% compared to traditional stores. You pick a diamond, whether it's lab-created or earth-created, James Allen has over 200,000 conflict-free stones. Then you pick your ring setting and metal. And if you need some help, they have real-time diamond consultations available, where an expert can walk you through it all. Get 25% off your order at JamesAllen.com code podcast. That's JamesAllen.com code podcast.
We now send it back to the Powercat Podcast.
Welcome back to part 2 of this special recruiting heavy kind of post-signing day edition of the Powercat Podcast Sources Podcast. Once again, I am Ryan Wallace, joined by Kevin Flaherty. And Kevin, let's get right to what will be one of the most hotly debated classes that I can remember in the 2022 Sunflower State rankings. It's about that time that we kind of start to think about 2022. I hate to do it when there's still technically another signing day to come, but whether it's KU, K-State, it just seems like, I think, what is it, the industry standard right now, like 80% that sign in December. So, I mean, sure, at this point, you're just kind of filling holes. So let's go ahead and talk about the state of Kansas, because I know on the message boards at GoPowercat, everybody wants to know not only just the order that this class could fall in from a ranking standpoint, but just how deep it will be. You look at right now the top 24/7 for 2022. And again, folks, this is still very much in flux because it's only a top 9 now. And as you'll hear from Kevin and I coming up, it's a lot deeper than that. But as we stand here today, Dasan McCullough, the Ohio State commit, number 1, Jalen Marshall at 2 from St. Thomas Aquinas, Caden Crawford at 3, Jaron Kanik at 4, and Gavin Myers at 5. Those are 2 Hayes products. And right outside of that, Nick Herzog, Landon Dean, Tyson Struber, Sterling Lockett. Kevin, let's start by just the overview of this class. Agree or disagree that this is going to be the deepest class in recent memory? I mean, if you can think of a year as far as depth that this compares to, hit me. But I really do think, especially in the top 10, but maybe even further outside of that, deepest class I can recall in many, many years.
Well, Ryan, we obviously have our spreadsheet, where we try to list guys out early and say, hey, these guys are potential Division I guys, and not all of them will wind up there. But I think we're over 35 now, and at this time of year, to be that high. You know, we haven't even found the guy that, you know, was 6'2" as a junior and is, you know, going to grow 2 inches, or the guy who puts on 20 pounds, or the guy that surprises everybody, you know, coming into a combine or whatever. I mean, these are the guys that we know about, like at this point, with their junior seasons just ending. And we're already at that point. And it's funny because I think it's tough to figure a top 10 for this class because of how deep it is. I think it's darn near impossible to figure a top 5 with how, you know, good the class is. But I think the thing that stands out even more than that, because I think the 2023 class could be the most special that Kansas has had at the top of the class that it's had in a while. I think where 2022 stands out is there may be 25 or 30 kids in this state that are legitimately Division I prospects next year.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at it will not shock me if the vast majority of the top 10 are guys that have at least 5 Power 5 offers individually. You know, I mean, it will be surprising if any of the top 10 do not land at Power 5 schools, regardless of what the school is. And when you think about the order, that's when things get really chaotic. I mean, I was talking earlier in the high school season with a friend of ours, you know, counterpart in the recruiting industry, well, formerly, but still obviously knows the pulse of Kansas recruiting as well as anybody, Jeremy Crabtree. And I was talking to him about how much you and I have struggled basically with who comes after Dasan McCullough. Because regardless of what you think of Dasan McCullough, which I will leave off of this podcast, the 2 to 10 could be anybody. I mean, literally anybody. I think you could make a case anyway that Tyson Struber could be 2. I mean, it's a little wild. It's maybe a little bit further out there since he's 8-man, or a guy like Landon Dean that we're high on from Frontenac that's a little bit smaller classification. But again, I wouldn't sit here and immediately cut you off if you said something like that. So 2 to 10 is wild. Is there, to put you on the spot right now, aside from Dasan McCullough, is there a player or two that maybe most excites you, or that you are most confident in their ability to develop and carry maybe the strongest career through college?
You know, it's funny because, you know, the guy who's number 7 right now in, you know, our rankings is Landon Dean, and a coaching friend that you and I both share, you know, has said that of Dean, he said that's an Oklahoma offensive tackle. Like, that kid will be, you know, an Oklahoma level offensive tackle, and he's not in the top 5. And you know, I'm not saying he shouldn't be. I'm not saying that he isn't actually, but that's how deep this group is. You know, it's Jalen Marshall. We currently have it at number 2, and his ability, I think, excites you, wouldn't you say? Like,
yes.
I think that when you're looking at the highest ceiling prospects, Jalen Marshall is probably up there, you know, if not as the number 2 guy to Dasan. You know, he's in that conversation because his ceiling is so high. I think that when you look at, you know, kind of where they're at, you know, combining ceiling and where they're at actually, Nick Herzog is a guy that I love. You know, I think that Nick Herzog is a big-time offensive tackle. I like the athleticism. I like the feet. I like the frame. You know, I think that he's probably a safer bet than Jalen Marshall to get to his ceiling. And I think that his ceiling is still relatively high. And the other guy that I really like, and I would probably have higher than maybe even some other people, is Jaron Kanik, because I think that with the size that he brings and it, you know, based on recent videos and everything, when we saw him, he measured 197 at the Sharp Performance Combine. He looks about 210 now, and he was a guy that, you know, ran, I think, what was it, 4.41, I think, at the Sharp Combine.
Yeah.
And he stands out on tape. He runs by the guys he doesn't run over. And that latter part is probably the most important part of it, because he is just a devastating blocker at this point. And so the thing that's tough with Jaron, I think, is that I think that Jaron will probably outgrow the wide receiver position. I think that he's somebody that if he grows another inch or so, then he's somebody that, has a chance to be that 6'3", 235, H-back. But he's going to be a 6'3", 235-pound H-back that has the strength and power to put guys on their backs and yet also have the speed to just run right by them. And so he's a guy that, based on his tape and the athletic profile and, kind of where I think we see his body going at this point, I realize H-back, it's not as exciting as saying, oh, you've got a 6'5" defensive end over here, or this guy's a quarterback or whatever. But I think that his skill set at that position would be so unique that he's a guy that I would have in that top 3 or 4 myself.
Yeah, you took the two guys that I think seem to stand out for me as well. Kanik is a guy that I'm, like you, really high on. I'm glad we have him at 4. I know composite-wise, other sites have him a little bit lower. I just think his versatility, regardless of where he plays, he has shown on film that he can be a difference maker on both sides. And Nick Herzog he's like you said, I think that was a great way to describe Nick Herzog, is I think he probably is one of the safest bets of this group. I think Jalen Marshall is up there as far as a safe bet. And I think Caden Crawford is a pretty safe bet from a standpoint of all 3 of those guys could come in and do something right away at their positions. Not necessarily, be freshman All-American types, but I mean, you kind of know what you're going to get when they come in. And so that's going to be interesting. And then, there are so many other names, and that kind of leads me to one of our questions out there from Z-Train11. Any sleepers in the Kansas 2022 class that we should be on the lookout for? I mean, I'm thinking of names that aren't even in the top 10, but they're not talked about because the top 10 is so strong or top 9 is so strong. When you factor in a guy like Mekhi Miller, but Equantez Love is out there. Henry Martin is out there. The offensive lineman at Derby, Alex Key.
Yeah.
is out there. There are a lot of guys. Gavin Bell at El Dorado. So, are there any sleepers out there for you and maybe some other guys that we didn't touch on in the top 10 that have that ability to potentially land at a KU or K-State?
Noah Smith's another one that I feel like in any other class, you would be talking about him a little bit more. A guy who's not in the top 10, amazingly to me, and yet has really good ability and a K-State offer, is Silas Etter. How in the world does that guy not have, is he not a top? I think that shows the depth of this group. And, there's another Deneen coming out. I mean, and so it's funny. There's so many, of these guys that I feel like you can throw a rocket and kind of hit a sleeper. I don't think, did we talk about Caden Barber at Pittsburgh?
Didn't talk about Caden Barber. Didn't talk about Henry Martin.
Colin Williams at Liège.
Yeah.
I mean, there are guys just all over the place. It's funny too. So Caden Crawford is number 3 in our rankings, and he may wind up dropping a little bit. I don't know about in our rankings, but I mean composite, because I think there are guys that people get more excited about. But Ryan, do you get a little bit of Tanner Wood from him?
Yeah. I mean,
and Tanner Wood was top of his class. So I think that I get a lot of Tanner Wood when I see Caden Crawford. Both of them were quarterbacks at the high school level. I think they're similar from a frame standpoint, probably fairly similar from an athleticism standpoint. And like I said, Tanner Wood was the number 1 guy in his class in the state. So, that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea, what's going on at the top of this and how tough it is to find these guys. my buddy JP Rock, who runs a lot of the combines and stuff in the state of Missouri, I guess they had Caden Crawford show up there this year, and they got him in the low 4.7s, as a guy who's 235, 240. And so when you're that kind of athlete at that size, and you're the football player that Caden is and everything, I mean, it's almost like he's a sleeper in position to where he could eventually end up in this class.
And keep in mind, too, when we talk about 2022 locally, there's also a heavy amount of offers going out on the Kansas City, Missouri side from Kansas State. You think about a guy like Jason Essex at Winnetonka, Moutier Rubin at Park Hill South, Armand Mimbo at Lee Summit North is out there, Carson Willich, Big Ike Izogu, both of those guys from Blue Springs. Every single one of those guys that I named has a K-State offer already. And so what goes back to something that we talked about before the break, Kevin, and it applies really to KU as well if they choose to go this route, is K-State loves to start from the inside out. They love to kind of see what they can get early on from the local kids and then fill gaps where they weren't able to do that locally. I really think that K-State is in a position as we sit here today where they could have, in what we anticipate being a little bit of a smaller numbers class in 2022, they might get the vast majority of their class done locally. I think they sit in a really, really good position with a handful of the guys that we've already talked about.
Has K-State offered the Quentin Conley kid too out of Pembroke Hill?
They have not.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, he's another one. It's funny because I think if you're a receivers coach, why would you leave the general, the general area? I mean, if you feel like Canick can play wide receiver, you've got Struber there, Makai Miller, you've got the different guys, Moutier Rubin, Jason Essex, Quentin Conley, all these guys are, within a couple hours or so of Manhattan. I mean, why would you leave to go get a wide receiver in this class? And it's not just wide receiver that looks like that, but it is a class that I think, if you're looking at K-State and specifically the way that they recruit, Kansas obviously hasn't been, as heavy locally, but I think you're starting to see Kansas realizing the 2022 class is as stacked as it is because they've offered a bunch of guys in the Kansas City area. They've offered 5 or 6 guys out of, our top 10 or so guys in the state as well. And so I do think that there's a very real possibility, Ryan, that if we're talking about another, say, 15-man K-State class, just sort of, spitballing based on the fact that these are going to be smaller classes probably, K-State could wind up with, 8 or 10 of those guys being locally at least. I mean, and they don't have to go anywhere else. If they can stay in state and get Nick Herzog and Landon Dean as their offensive tackles, boom, that's it. If you can stay in state and get, a couple of those wide receivers, you're good there. Caden Crawford is your defensive end. Bam, you're good. I mean, and it's like that all over the place. I mean, if you're looking at an interior lineman, you can go to Derby and get Alex Key and get a guy that I think is probably going to be a Big 12 lineman. So, yeah, I do think that this year, maybe more than any that I can remember, K-State or KU have the chance to build the majority of their class from local kids, and I can't remember ever seeing that.
And that means that on top of all the names that we've already told you about, it could be a big year for other teams to come in. I'm thinking about the MAC. I'm thinking about, Conference USA, the AAC, that could come in and get some guys that I think K-State would normally and KU love to try and get as walk-ons. But to just be honest with you, they're probably better than walk-ons. Jordan Brown, Tyler Claiborne, those are 2 really gifted receivers that I think warrant scholarship offers at some level. Brant.
I both like Colin McCartney at Frontenac is kind of a frame athlete who could be like a box safety or whatever at the next level. And there are guys like that all over the place. Yeah. It's wild.
Zach Sizemore, Brant Cox out at Salina South. I mean, there are a bunch of guys that just, jump out to you.
The defensive tackle at Free State is Newhouse.
Ty Newhouse.
Yeah, he's another one that you look at and you say, maybe in previous years, this kid, winds up at KU or K-State as a preferred walk-on. And while the class is going to be smaller across the board, I think all over the place, I also think that this class is deep enough that, if you're, a MAC school or you're Tulane or whoever, you feel like you can poke around and get somebody that is better than that caliber. And some of these guys are going to wind up being invited walk-ons because of the smaller classes. And so you're going to wind up getting somebody like, say, Noah Palmer at Olathe North, as an invited walk-on or whatever. And he's probably going to be a little bit better than what you typically get as an invited walk-on.
That's what I was going to ask you about is do you see K-State among many other schools, but particularly K-State because of just how deep this in-state pool is? Do you feel like they're going to have to get maybe a little crafty in 2022 to convince a Noah Palmer or a Jacob Parrish, for instance, at Olathe North to walk on? Kids that, like you said, are probably better than what you would normally get as walk-ons and probably will be poached by some of those, group of five programs. I mean, is this where something like a blue shirt, I guess, comes in handy?
You just said the magic word, right? I mean, it's funny because I think both you and I loved what K-State did with the blue shirt in this class. They were able to find some guys that were basically scholarship players and get them to be scholarship players without getting them, to count on the scholarship rolls, so to speak. And so to do that and be able to get players of that caliber, they might have to pull out some blue shirts to get some of these guys in that maybe they feel like, hey, this is a guy that, maybe normally we would have been able to talk into this, but, we're going to go ahead and have to offer a little something extra to get these guys in here, and it's the thing that'll be interesting to me, Ryan, and I don't know how you feel about this class has a lot of athletes to it, but I think it also has a lot of big-bodied kids.
Yes.
And so when you look at the way K-State and to a lesser extent Kansas, but KU has still had some success with this, they've gotten some of those guys into their programs over the years. The guy who's maybe 6'3", 285, and they get him to come in, as a walk-on, and they've grown him, and they've basically been scholarship players by the time they finished up. This class is full of those guys. If you're looking for somebody who is 6'3" plus, 265 plus, there are a lot of those guys in the state of Kansas this year.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about in 2021, Chris Dawson will have some fun getting some of those guys ready. If they land really a whole host of these guys from 2022, it'll be more about maintaining, maybe even kind of thinning out and trimming some of those guys down as opposed to bulking up. I know you've got to run. You're a busy man, but for the fans out there that are maybe curious when rankings might be updated for 2022, do you have any insight into when the guys up the ladder might get around to kind of finalizing at least that first stage of 2022 rankings?
I think there's usually a little bit of a deep breath right after early signing period. And then it seems like there is some work done in January on those rankings, because let's be honest, once you hit signing day in February, the very next day you're looking to see who your team has a chance to get for that next class. And so I do think that those will be updated sometime in the next month or two. I think that you'll start to see, really with the depth of this Kansas class, you'll start to see guys who haven't been rated yet, maybe even looked at more than the guys who have been looked at and rated so far. So if you're looking at, Landon Dean to make a big move, I don't know that this is going to be that ranking session for that to happen. But if you're looking for Alex Keed to get rated, period, this is probably going to be about when you would start to see that stuff. And it's nice too. And I know you agree with me, Ryan. Our national guys, they're pretty willing to pick up the phone and talk about a lot of these guys. And so it's nice that these guys are getting more exposure and everything. And I think that there's a very real chance that 2022 winds up being something special.
Yep. You will not see this group limited to a top 10. Give it a couple more weeks, and I think the guys at 24/7, us included, will have this to a top 15 or a top 20. So that will wrap up this special edition of the Sources Podcast. Kevin, can't thank you enough. And hopefully, like I said, if you're not following him already when it comes to high school football and in the state of Kansas and what K-State and KU are doing, give him a follow right now. What's the handle, Kevin?
Handle is at K Flaherty 247.
There you go. And of course, college basketball stuff as well. But for the purposes of this podcast, he's a football man. So once again, thank you for tuning in to the Powercat Podcast Sources Edition, post early signing day. More coverage to come on the 24/7 Sports Network at GoPowercat.com.
Powercat Podcast. All rights reserved. GoPowercat.com and Spirit Street Publishing.
With Blue Link Plus, you can access your Hyundai Tucson Limited remotely. Doors unlocked, temperature set, lost car found.
There it is.
Get complimentary class-leading Blue Link Plus. Call 562-314-4603 for complete details.